Hello, people. So, when some intense controversy flares up on social media that has the potential to inflame culture war division, my general impulse is to try to figure out a way to discuss what's at issue without giving in to the paradigm set forth by culture warriors on either side, wherever they may be situated on the political spectrum. It doesn't mean that necessarily the culture warriors are morally equivalent or that they're both equally harmful in every respect. It's just to say that I feel as though legitimizing the framework that they're operating within is itself damaging, because culture war is generally something foisted upon the public so that regular people are at each other's throats over subjects that at essence are kind of ephemeral and just trigger certain emotional responses where you're fighting over stuff having to do with race, religion, gender, etc., all the hot button social topics. And you kind of craft a political identity around that set of topics, which distracts from crafting an identity around the real dividing lines in society and where power is actually wielded. So I've been averse to culture warfare for as long as I've had any kind of political and social consciousness. It's not to say that I don't have certain preferences in terms of what policies should be enacted that have some bearing on culture war issues. It's just that operating within that state of mind, I feel, is very pernicious. So when something comes up that has a culture war dimension, my initial instinct typically is to say, okay, I know people are going to get upset about this for predictable kind of tribal reasons. Is there an angle that can be ascertained that maybe brings out a different dimension of the story that isn't necessarily geared toward ginning up this kind of base level hair trigger reaction, which lends itself to getting a lot of interactions on social media? It lends itself to, rattling off these incendiary barbs that are going to just stoke a big reaction, but really just kind of peddle the same tedious framing that at least I am sick of, and I think a lot of people are sick of as well, but can't really articulate often why it is that they're so disillusioned by culture war. So, an instance of this happened yesterday when Kyle Kashuv, I hope I'm pronouncing that roughly correctly, that's how I've heard it pronounced, announced on Twitter that he had his admission to Harvard rescinded. Okay, and this person, as I'm sure many of you are aware, came into prominence because he was at the Parkland high school shooting in February of 2018. And he, unlike many of his classmates, was of a more conservative disposition. Whatever, that's his prerogative. So some of the kind of organizational conservative or right-wing institutions latched onto him, gave him a platform, and, so be it. But he was apparently admitted to Harvard, and once some of his private communications had come out, or at least communications that he had kind of unthinkingly assumed were going to be private, Harvard was made aware of these communications and then decided to revoke his admission to Harvard. And here's where the temptation to get into a culture war kind of like battle stance needs to be resisted. I don't even want to get into the substance of what he said. It's not even the point. At least, it's not the point that I want to emphasize. Okay? The point is, or at least the point that I wish to bring to bear, is think of what we're doing now to children who are being conditioned to enter elite society. So if you're trying to get into the Ivy League, especially Harvard or Yale or what have you, generally you're trained from a very young age to enter a certain trajectory where you have sufficient credentials where you can be admitted to a highly prestigious university such as that, and you're basically then almost guaranteed entry into various elite sectors of professional life. What are we essentially doing now? We're evaporating the realms in which kids, and the guy was 16 when he was making these comments. I'm going to call him a kid at that stage, okay? Yeah, if you're 16, you have certain rights and arguably responsibilities that, a 13-year-old doesn't have. But, your brain is still underdeveloped. You're not a legal adult for most purposes. So, yeah, I'm going to call him a kid, okay? And he was in a forum that he thought was basically private amongst friends, where he had no reasonable expectation that these communications were going to be recorded and preserved and then promulgated later on when he happened to, by happenstance, became a somewhat public figure. And then those communications are used to harm him in terms of his academic/career prospects. Okay, so he had no reasonable expectation that anything he was saying was public. Maybe he should have had that expectation, but the point is it's officious or it's invasive to say that kids BSing with one another, however offensive they may be, and if you want to call what he said offensive, I'm not going to dispute that, but that's not even what I'm really trying to discuss here. It's the nature of how the spheres in which kids have privacy is being eroded. Think of this, okay? So you're 16 and you're with your 16-year-old friends, and you're just sitting around at somebody's house BSing. Okay, you're making fun of people, you're maybe making some offensive remarks, you are castigating people, you're being mean, you're being funny, you're trying to outdo one another. I'm not saying that everybody who does that necessarily engages in the same kind of rhetoric that this guy engaged in. I'm saying the idea that that BS session could be preserved and then used against you years later to tangibly damage your academic or career prospects is insane. It's an intrusion into your private sphere. And I think you actually do need to, we should demand that privacy be preserved in this manner, because if kids have to go through life thinking that everything they say at any moment, even when they're amongst friends, they're in an informal setting, they're just hanging out. Sorry. I still have a little bit of the cold. It's gotten better, but not 100%. Anyway, if kids now have to go through life with this kind of overweening paranoia that anything they say at any time could be surreptitiously recorded or saved unbeknownst to them and then used against them later on, that's just going to produce kids who are utterly terrified to ever transgress potential social taboos, because it could then be held against them. And some taboos are in place for good reason. But that doesn't justify any violation of the taboo, if done in a private setting, automatically being exposed just because you feel that the taboo is correct and somebody wrongly violated it. This is all just to say this is about just basic fairness to young people. It's about not using every incident such as this to grind your culture war axe. Think about the broader implications. Think about somebody else in a different position. Say some other individual who says, I don't know, ISIS is great, and I want to blow up. The Empire State Building. Let's say they're joking. It's obvious they're joking, okay? But very easily, stuff like that, even if it's done in the context of a BS session, or it's just a matter of one-upsmanship in terms of how inflammatory of a joke can I make with my friends, a statement like that, if it happens to be done on an electronic venue, could be preserved and then used against that person later on to demand that their admission to some university be rescinded, and that would be equally ridiculous. So it's not about his particular political orientation, even though he happens to be a conservative. It just so happens that he has a high profile, and therefore this happening to him ended up getting a lot of attention. And I'm sure there are other examples from lesser known people where you could point to something similar happening, but we just don't really know about it because, they didn't attain the stature as this individual, Kyle, just kind of coincidentally did. So, I'm not even engaging with the substance of what he said because it wasn't even substantive. It was just him being an idiot with his friends in a informal, friend-like setting. It's just like, I don't think teenagers interacting with their friends in a quasi-private setting, even if it turned out not to be private, should be subject for adult scrutiny. Let kids have their own private encounters with their friends that are just contained to that environment. It shouldn't be our province to assess everything that a teenager says in, what they perceive to be the privacy of their own little friend group. I think kids need to be given the latitude to say stupid stuff, so long as it doesn't explicitly harm anybody or, it's not violent, that kind of stuff. Even the most ridiculous and quote offensive jokes, if they're that bad, let them mature. Most people grow out of it. It's very common for teenagers. I'm not saying every teenager is going to say what this kid said. And there is a type of young person which will go to the stupid racial jokes that aren't particularly funny and are just pure trolling and incendiary. I'm not justifying that. I'm trying to justify a greater awareness of the way in which that just basic privacy is being collapsed, especially by so many of young kids' interactions being recorded and preserved for the public record in digital form. I think that's a dangerous precedent. And it's not about this one individual, really. I mean, it's just an emblem for a wider set of issues that are affecting almost everybody. And let me just restate it here for absolute clarity. Teens having what they regarded as, rightly or wrongly, private communications recorded and exposed to harm their academic career prospects is a bigger issue than this one teen, Kyle, being denied admission to Harvard. It's emblematic of a wider trend that is undoubtedly stifling, invasive, and privacy killing. So that's what I'm focusing on here more so than this one person. This person just happened to be the impetus for a kind of broader discussion of these issues, which are actually really important, because if every kid is now held to a standard where one ridiculous screw up that is made in private can then follow them for the rest of their lives, really? At 16? I mean, do you want to be held accountable for everything that you said in private with friends at age 16? I doubt very many people do. Even if you didn't engage in the same kind of rhetoric as this kid did. So that's basically the way in which I feel the issue is best approached. And you kind of avoid the culture war squabbling, at least I think, if you adopt that kind of approach. You're not excusing anything. You're simply trying to put it in a broader perspective. And that's what I'd like to leave it at. Also, I should add that, of course, these elite institutions mandate that all their potential entrants have almost a squeaky clean record, and that's nothing new. What's new is the additional domains that are being opened up to official scrutiny on the part of parents, colleges, prospective employers. Whereas like in 1995 or something, there was no ability to use your BS session with friends to admit or deny admission to you. You couldn't use your BS sessions with friends, obviously, as a basis to determine whether you're granted entry into a university. But now that is available because kids just kind of exist online. They don't even conceive of themselves as doing anything that's public for the most part when they engage this way online. And yet it could still be held against them. And that's what I think is troubling, because it's going to stifle independent thought. It's going to instill kind of a paranoia and an oppressiveness in a lot of people where they can't even like express views that might be later deemed offensive for fear of having to jeopardize their academic or career prospects. And it's just not an inviting scenario for anybody who wants to foster a climate for young people where they can experiment with stuff. They can say stuff that's stupid. They can, make amends for it. They can be offensive. They can learn from their mistakes. They can do what basically kids have done for eons, for centuries, since the dawn of time. And that's what I object to. And I don't want to get into a emotionally reactive debate over what this person said. It's not about what he said. It's about the age at which he said it, the venue in which he said it, and the manner in which what he said is being scrutinized to be held against him. And there are all kinds of ridiculous requirements that elite institutions impose, irrespective of Kyle Kashuv. And there's a great book called Excellent Sheep by William Dereshowitz, I think I'm pronouncing that right, from 2014, where he lays out how kids have to be trained from, birth, basically, to have all these extracurriculars and have all these, academic achievements and just be these perfect little angels so they can get into Harvard, and then they basically just end up perpetuating a failed status quo because they're conditioned to believe that their upbringing makes them kind of divinely endowed with the right to run society. And so there are plenty of issues with, how these admissions process work regardless. But One thing that is new is the surveillance that is being imposed upon people, not just Kyle, but others, to kind of punish behavior that previously would have been unpunishable because it just would have been private. And we lose a lot when we lose privacy, and we shouldn't cheer the erosion of privacy just because if in a particular instance it seems to be funny or it seems to disadvantage somebody that we dislike politically. Okay? So that's it. Bye-bye.